Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this Bright Blue and Local Trust online seminar, where we're discussing strengthening communities in left behind areas, lessons from the US. For those of you who don't know us, Bright Blue is an independent think tank, and our job really is to defend and improve liberal society. And Local Trust, who we're partnering with, is a place-based funder supporting communities to achieve their ambitions. Both organisations have been at the forefront of research and analysis here in the UK to support people and places in so-called left-behind areas. If you're tweeting about this event, please use the hashtags #BrightBlue and hashtag Community US UK. And our Twitter handles are @WeAreBrightBlue and @LocalTrust. If you want to ask questions, you can do that via Slido. The link for this is just under the live stream that you're watching on our YouTube channel now. I will ask them on behalf of you, so please do remember to put your name and where you're from when you ask that question. Before we go to those questions, we're going to hear from a great range of speakers, transatlantic speakers, from politicians and thought leaders who have been thinking hard and acting ambitiously on civic regeneration for some time, both in the UK and the US. And the context for this debate is the new, impressively sizable US Community Revitalization Fund, recently announced by the Biden administration. We want to, in this debate, find out a little bit more about the motivations for this fund and the specific activities and outcomes it's seeking to facilitate, in tandem with wider initiatives in the US to help economically and socially deprived communities. And we want to find out the differences between this new fund in the US and the UK's Levelling Up Fund. And I suppose more broadly, how US and UK approaches to civic regeneration might differ and converge, of course. In the UK, the Levelling Up agenda is still quite nascent, admittedly. A white paper, forthcoming white paper, is likely to put flesh on the bones, but lots of politicians and policymakers here in the UK are stressing that it should be about igniting civic pride and activity in poor areas, bringing life to public places and spaces, not just about investment and employment in these areas, important as those are. So, as we really start to set the focus and the outcomes for the UK's Levelling Up agenda, now is a good time to learn from the US. So to share their thoughts, we have Robin Keegan, who's the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Development in the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. We have Danny Kruger, MP, who is Conservative MP for Devizes and the founder of the new Social Covenant Unit, and Ryan Streeter, who is the Director of Domestic Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Diana Johnson, MP, who's been a Labour MP since 2005 and is the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on Left Behind Neighbourhoods. And Jennifer Vey, who is Senior Fellow and Brookings Metropolitan Policy Programme and Director at Anne T. and Robert M. Bass Centre for Transformative Placemaking. Bit of a mouthful, that last one. Hopefully I got it right. So we'll go to the speakers. We'll start with Robin, if you want to kick off. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. I want to thank Bright Blue and the Local Trust for the invitation to join this esteemed group of panelists today. The partnership with the UK at this critical juncture in the pandemic is timely as both countries continue to respond and set the stage for long-term recovery from the pandemic. I look forward to our continued learnings from one another's work. I'm excited to be able to engage in this dialogue about how we better invest in people and places. While this topic was important prior to COVID, the pandemic and the civic unrest following the death of George Floyd last summer continue to expose deep fissures in our communities. We have seen, as we often do after disasters, the vulnerable in our communities suffer the greatest health and economic impacts. This is most true for people of color and tribal communities who have suffered illness, death, and loss of work at greater levels than other communities due to histories of disinvestment. This is also true within urban centers, suburban, rural areas, as well as tribal lands. While the loss and disruption have been staggering, we've also witnessed the immense resourcefulness and innovation of people, small business owners, and workers in supporting their communities. The pandemic put a spotlight on the importance of civic infrastructure and social capital. We saw this in the importance of civic infrastructure to support communities' health and well-being. While we lost our traditional places to gather, bars, churches, theaters, even work, we saw communities innovate public and private space to keep some civic life going. Communities rethought the public dimension to repurpose the street as public space so that residents could safely gather, dine, and recreate. The public park became a refuge in our communities, along with this added street space. We also saw people lead. They developed solutions for their communities. We saw restaurant owners set up pop-up feeding stations for communities, businesses pivoting to make hand sanitizer or masks, neighbors making masks or using their skills with technology to help other neighbors sign up for vaccine appointments. Our job now is to catalyze this innovation and to make sure that we continue to invest in this social capital building through civic infrastructure projects. We have a historic opportunity in our respective countries to invest in these things that are proven to work. The Biden-Harris administration recognizes the critical role that civic infrastructure plays in building strong communities and opportunities for residents and small businesses within those communities to thrive. And it has committed $10 billion in a proposal through its Build Back Better strategy to fund the Community Revitalization Fund, a community-led redevelopment projects to create civic infrastructure, the physical spaces that support a community's social, economic, and civic fabric. The fund will invest directly in community-led organizations to create innovative, shared amenities, spark new local economic opportunity, provide services, build community wealth, and strengthen social cohesion. This historic commitment will spur the build-out of critical physical, social, and civic infrastructure in distressed and disadvantaged communities. These projects have proven to increase not only the economic strength of communities, but also the social capital glue that binds a community together. The administration has rooted its funding proposal in the 4 pillars that are driving the administration's work: COVID recovery, racial equity, economic recovery, and climate resilience. These pillars and the historic investments being made to bring relief to communities and build back better represent a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to transform communities across the country. As the nation's investment partner, we here at HUD are honored to have the opportunity to make these investments to restore a social safety net and set conditions for economic recovery. In addition to the Community Revitalization Fund, the President's agenda for HUD includes historic investments to address longstanding public housing capital needs, produce, preserve, and retrofit affordable, resilient, and energy-efficient housing units, to eliminate exclusionary zoning and harmful land use policies, and to invest in housing and expand economic and community development in Indian country. The Community Revitalization Fund is also part of a larger portfolio of programs to support local communities, especially those that have experienced historical disinvestment. These include a project in our sister agency, the Department of Transportation, called Thrive in Communities, which will restore communities that were sliced through by highways more than many decades ago. Many of these were through historically Black neighborhoods. This fund is looking to put the community at the center of thinking through what the future of their community should be, whether or not those highways exist in that community. The administration is also investing $5 billion in a rural partnership fund to support rural communities across America in developing their economic future. All of these programs are centered on investing in communities where they are, addressing the inequity of the past and building for future success of residents and local communities. The Community Revitalization Fund, as many of the Biden-Harris administration proposals, is ambitious, and as I had mentioned before, builds off the great work already happening in communities. The broad goals of the fund are to deliver resources directly to communities through their own organizations, to increase community ownership and leadership, and to foster the creation of generational wealth. The fund is built on two principles: trust and partnership. Trust, people know what they need, and they should be in the lead of setting the vision for meeting that need and leading the implementation. Partnership, we also know that it takes a village to get projects done. Many of the civic infrastructure models that the program is built off of are partnerships of local organizations, philanthropy, community development finance institutions, and other partners, including local governments. We believe this partnership model will increase the capacity of organizations and of residents to realize their vision. The fund will invest in distressed communities, those communities that have experienced generational poverty due to declines in industry, including agriculture. It will also invest in areas that have seen a lot of growth, but where investment has not always reached the entire community, and many residents are facing the pressures of rising property taxes and rents that often lead to displacement. As I've mentioned, the fund builds off of pre-existing models, but it's unique to HUD in the way that HUD typically funds. HUD typically funds communities, jurisdictions, states, and local governments. And those states and local governments work through a process with their community to determine priorities. This fund is different. This fund will go directly to local organizations as well as their partners to realize the organizations and the residents' vision. Briefly, just a few of the goals of the fund that I've mentioned previously, just want to go over those quickly. The fund will strengthen social cohesion and build community wealth. We'll prioritize projects that strengthen social and economic links so that neighborhoods become places of opportunity where residents can afford to live and wealth is created in the community. We'll build capacity through partnerships, as mentioned, as well as investing in technical assistance for organizations to learn the ropes of handling federal funding, as well as developing large-scale projects. We're also looking to spark new local economic activity and unlock private capital. We're also committed to making sure that funds stay within the community and that residents and small businesses within that local community have the opportunity to work and have contracts within those projects. We're also focused on incorporating equitable and climate resilience design to promote the best of American design for projects that are built for people and for the future. We're excited about the dialogue today, and we look forward to learning more about the partnership and the work being done in the UK as well as around the US. And I look forward to continuing this dialogue. Thank you for the time. And I'll pass it back to you, Ryan.
Thank you, Robin. That was very thorough and detailed, and really gave us much more detail on what the administration's plans are around this new Community Revitalization Fund. Just a quick question from me, which is just reflecting on the UK. Actually, our agenda around levelling up and restoring civic pride and activity in so-called left behind areas was really a pre-COVID thing, and was very much a response to, well, politically, it felt there was a lot of impetus behind it as a result of Brexit, and that people in those places were feeling they weren't being listened to adequately enough. And so much more attention is focused on those areas, including not just economic revival, but also community revival as well. So actually the whole kind of debate around levelling up here is pre-COVID, whereas actually what's quite interesting about what you've said about the Revitalisation Fund is that one of its central pillars is around COVID recovery. And I'm just interested in the US, what you feel the impact has been of COVID on civicness, on civic activity, on civic institutions. What has, in your opinion, been the kind of main outcomes, both positive and negative, from COVID, which is obviously something that this fund is trying to reflect on and act on?
Great, thank you. I appreciate the question. I will say that the bones of the civic infrastructure work, have been longstanding. So there has, and I know Jennifer will talk a lot about this in terms of really the history of place-based work within the country, which has been longstanding. It's been longstanding here at HUD. There are many programs that have in the past developed strategies for supporting local communities through a place-based way in order to support communities that have been distressed historically and looking for additional ways to bring investment. So, but to your question, I think that COVID and the civic unrest last summer really did put a laser focus on our civic institutions and on the importance of our social fabric. It really it was really a call to all of us to really stand up and to support our neighbors in the way that we could. It leaned on the networks that were existing, whether they were formal networks or informal networks within communities, really often led by civic organizations or at least supported by civic organizations. So we saw new solutions being developed. For example, we saw, and I would imagine that in the UK you saw this as well, we saw, our food bank system be where, helping communities and residents who are in dire need of food access, really standing up and meeting that challenge, pivoting and finding new ways to feed communities, but also by partnering with our farmers across the country whose own supply chains had been disrupted. Restaurants weren't open, they didn't have anywhere for their food to go. So being able to connect the dots between the need for food in our communities, our food bank infrastructure, as well as our farmers, were some of the innovations that we saw. So, I think that what COVID has done at a very large scale is something that I've seen in the past in my disaster recovery experience is communities step up to meet the gaps immediately that they see in the community after disaster. And we have an opportunity now post-COVID, or while we're still living with COVID, to really build on the strength of those civic organizations to help them to do that work better. Often they're doing it with very little funding, really just by the will of the staff that are there. And so how can we bring funding to them that helps them to build their own capacity in doing that work, and then helps them to build those types of response plans that they may need, both now as we see new variants coming through for COVID, but also for other crises that communities are going to be experiencing with climate change, with disasters, with economic downturns.
Thank you, Robin. Incredibly interesting insights there. Thank you. We're going to kind of hop over to the other side of the Atlantic, and we'll do that between all the speakers, and we'll go to Danny Kruger now. And it must be music to your ears, Danny, that this new revitalization fund, the Department for Housing and Urban Development, is proposing to directly fund community organizations themselves rather than go through branches of government. And it's interesting just comparing it to the UK, because obviously a lot of our regeneration initiatives have often been through local government, and I think the Levelling Up Fund has to be mediated through MPs. But anyway, maybe you'll come to that a little bit later. No doubt you've got opening remarks.
Thanks, Ron. Well, yes, I'm very encouraged to hear about the fund, and it is an inspiration to us, and I hope we'll be paying attention and learning lessons. Obviously, this is an agenda that we share over here, and as you said, Ryan, even before COVID struck, there was a real recognition of the political and economic imbalance in our country. Spatial inequality is the most pronounced divide that we have, and interestingly, it's the one that people care about the most, and it's absolutely unsustainable, the degree of geographic inequality in our country. So the government's very committed to doing to working on it. I remain optimistic about what is being done, hopeful of the plans that are emerging, and keen to see some particular elements of the funds that are being released clarified, because I think we've got to get some things right. Making the money available is only part of the story. In fact, it's very much secondary to how the money is distributed, to your point there, Ryan, and for its purposes. So, I mean, if we just quickly look at the problem, talk about spatial inequality, and we talk about left behind areas. I think you were right in your opening remarks, Ryan, to put that in inverted commas. This is not a new problem. These places, if they're left behind, they've been left behind pretty much since their heyday in the first part of the Industrial Revolution. And the maps of inequality are very old. We were worrying in the 1930s about the distressed areas. Now we're worried about left behind communities. They are the same places. And a century of effort hasn't ameliorated the problem. And so what can be done? A lot of it is about funding. We argue about the right proportion between funding on people and funding on places, which sort of equates to revenue versus capital funding, but not exactly. I mean, the fact is we need both. We need to invest in people, in skills and education, in direct economic opportunities, and we need to invest in places, in the infrastructure and the livability of a community. I think we have, we currently are radically imbalanced towards revenue funding that, as it were, goes to people through the very disconnected systems of the welfare state. That's where the bulk of funding goes, primarily through welfare. And we haven't invested traditionally and historically sufficiently in communities themselves through capital funding in places. And that is now being addressed through a whole range of funds that the government is putting in place. You might worry, I do slightly, about the number of them. You've got the Levelling Up Fund, you've got the High Streets Fund, the Towns Fund, the Community Ownership Fund recently announced, the Community Recovery Fund, and then the big one coming along is the UK Shared Prosperity Fund. All of these funds are very well intentioned and largely well designed, but we do need to achieve some coherence. And I hope the UK SPF, the Shared Prosperity Fund, which for our American colleagues is the successor to the European funding that we used to get when we were in the EU, British money, but it was directed by Brussels. We're now going to, as it were, design that funding ourselves. The aspects that I hope, and it was interesting to hear from Robin there, I think there's a lot we can learn about getting this right for the future. The elements I would like to see are, firstly, that the money is patient, it's long term. We've got to get beyond these short-term funding cycles that the government is bedeviled by. It's got to be flexible. It can't be, I mean, I don't mind if the funding goes directly from centre or via local government. There are pros and cons of both, but the important thing is it's not too prescriptive, wherever it's handed out from. Crucially, that it's going to have a strong social element, so we mustn't fixate too much on what we might call economic infrastructure. So I'm all for new train lines, definitely new broadband infrastructure, new, whatever it is, business parks and large-scale capital investments to create jobs. But beneath that and alongside it and around it, we need the institutions of communities, the gathering places that Robin was talking about, that give a place its sense of self and give young people and those who are struggling to reach the labour market and maybe people not in the labour market at all, a sense of belonging and purpose, because that is the real foundation for prosperity. And then finally, the key element to it all, and this is where I'm pushing the government for what it's worth from the backbenches to do more on, is around ownership. Who ultimately controls this money, and that's where I think we've got a way to go, because I believe very strongly that funding which isn't directed, owned, and that doesn't genuinely reflect the wishes of the people for whom it's spent will be wasted, even if the intentions are good, the metrics are right, the overall design has been really well thought through. Actually, if people don't have a sense that this is their investment, that they are responsible for it, and they are responsible for its success, we're going to miss a trick. And so why I support what Local Trust, your partners today, Ryan, are pushing for a large-scale community wealth fund, very much in line with what Robin's doing in the US. That will be an asset for communities and not just part of normal government spending. So I'm very encouraged by what we've learned. I think there are opportunities to get these big new funds right over the next few years, but the big prize, the long-term vision, I think, must be to take some billions, and there are ideas about where that could come from, and invest that in a permanent endowment to support the civil infrastructure of our communities, which is, I think, the long-term, an aspect of the long-term challenge of the places we're talking about. Thanks, Ryan.
Brilliant. Totally very thoughtful and eloquent from you, Danny. Just so I understand then, so there's obviously some positives from the US Community Revitalization Fund, the scale of it, the fact that it's funding community groups directly. Are there any more positives? And indeed, are there any features of it you've heard from Robin where you think actually maybe that wouldn't be quite right in a UK context? Maybe the themes that have been outlined or some other thing. I'm just interested in what the kind of, very briefly, what are the kind of main takeaway points you'd want to
well,
the UK?
What I was struck by, and I really agree with, is the sense that we need to build on the resourcefulness of communities themselves. And we did see during the pandemic the amazing capacity that places have to self-organise and to meet the needs of their neighbours. But that was a patchy picture in the UK. I'm sure it was the same in the US. And the places which had the resources anyway, the assets, not necessarily the richest places, and that's our whole point. It's about the places with kind of social capital, but that often does correlate to financial capital. So I think we've absolutely got to be building on the existing resources of communities, and not least for sort of COVID-style disasters, but all the challenges that we're facing in our future. We need to invest in the resilience of our communities. Obviously, there's a dimension in the US around civil protest, around race, and so on, which might not read across perfectly to here, but ultimately the challenge is the same, which is to bind together our divided societies. And I think we need to, goes back to my point about community power, the more people are given the opportunity to take responsibility and to work together across cultural, social divides, the more we will come together as a country. I mean, lastly, just very briefly, I'm not sure about the mechanism. I don't think we should necessarily say that the model that they're using there to directly fund from the centre is necessarily appropriate. We need to build they have this amazing system of a federal government and a strong states government. We have a very denuded local government in this country, very impoverished and weak, with the most centralised state in Europe. I think we need to be investing more in our local systems of delivery, but that doesn't mean that all money has to flow through local government. There are alternative methods of distributing money and power, but I'm not sure that a centralised fund is necessarily, or a centralised distribution mechanism is necessarily appropriate here.
Okay, understood. Okay, let's go back over the Atlantic to Ryan.
Great, thank you, Ryan, and it's good to be with all of my colleagues on this call. This important discussion. I really appreciate what's been said so far, and what I'd like to do is offer a few thoughts about the relationship between sort of civic infrastructure and social capital and the way that communities are designed. If we hope in our revitalization efforts to have more than, say, just affordable housing, but to have vibrant communities, I mean, true placemaking, we want to understand these questions a little bit more. And I have a long-standing personal and professional interest in this question of the relationship between social capital and other types of outcomes that we can measure in the economy, in terms of educational outcomes, in terms of economic productivity and the like. In fact, I was in London helping to get the Legatum Institute started a number of years ago and help build the Prosperity Index, which some of you may have seen, a global measure of wealth and well-being. And in the first 3 years, I think it's in its 11th year now. And one of the questions that drove that effort, not in whole, but an important part, was to understand how social capital itself, the networks that people live within, actually contribute to things like economic outcomes, health outcomes, education outcomes. And and coming fast forward from there, one of the things that I and my colleagues here have noticed in the literature that there hasn't been a whole lot of understanding about the way that the way that communities are designed and how they contribute to those actual those particular outcomes. And I'm particularly interested in this question because when I think about this small but important book from the 1970s, republished in the 1980s, called To Empower People by Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse, they identified 4 mediating institutions that they argued were really important for community level grassroots success: the family or the household, the voluntary association, neighborhood-based religious congregations, and then also neighborhoods. And since that time, we've seen a large body of social science on the first 3: the importance of families and the way households are formed and structured, the important role of voluntary associations in producing social capital and other economic outcomes, and also the role of religious and faith-based organizations as community actors. But there hasn't been quite as much about neighborhoods themselves. And so we've undertaken that in some of our survey research here to see what we could find. And what's interesting is that the positive civil society effects that you associate with a healthy civic sector, usually understood as a healthy sector of voluntary or charitable organizations, those same sorts of outcomes seem to manifest themselves in well-designed places that are rich in a balance of amenities. And by amenities, I mean neighborhood parks, supermarkets, libraries. We found that Americans love their libraries. In this digital age, apparently libraries are still very important as community centers. Gyms, even if you don't go to the gym, having one in your neighborhood seems to give you a more positive impression of it, just knowing that it's there. So we ask people what matters most in their neighborhood. Then we also look at how far they are from these amenities. And we found some things that are quite striking. So when people, regardless of income, if they live in a neighborhood where they are in close proximity, either a walking distance or a 5 to 10 minute drive from a nice balance of these sorts of amenities, supermarkets, parks, libraries, cafes, bars, restaurants, coffee shops, these sorts of things, they have a much higher rating for the well-being of their community itself. And so when we look at the kinds of things we care about when we're talking about social capital, they manifest themselves in well-designed communities too. So urban residents in high amenity neighborhoods are 4 times as likely as those in low amenity neighborhoods to rate their neighborhood as an excellent place, for instance. In the suburbs, it's twice as much. When you ask people about whether they live in a place where neighbors help one another, where there's civic reciprocity, we'll find that 2 times as many people in high amenity urban neighborhoods and 3 times as many people in suburban high amenity neighborhoods as opposed to their counterparts will say that they are. And when you look at the informal ways in which people care about their community, talking about community news, sharing what people have heard about the community, again, you'll see that nearly twice as many urban, small town, and suburban residents in high amenity places will report doing that with some level of frequency. Trust is one of those things that those of us who care about social capital look at a lot. What sorts of things generate community trust? And we find that within dense urban environments, only urban residents in high amenity neighborhoods, a majority will report having trust in people as opposed to you can't be too careful. There's this binary question that pollsters often ask. Do you think on general most people can be trusted, or do you think you cannot be too careful? In dense urban areas, only those in high amenity neighborhoods will say that you can trust people. And we've found that people, regardless of suburb, big city, small city, people that live in high amenity areas generally report higher levels of trust at work and at school. Finally, and this is important, I think, because it coheres with some of these things we found in building the Prosperity Index and others have found in looking at social capital, is that people that live within rich networks report greater confidence in their own financial future and in the general economic future of their neighborhood, city, or country. And so people that live in high amenity areas tend to have a more positive view of the future, depending on how you ask the question. And so we don't fully understand exactly what causes what here and what correlates with what, but what we do see is that regardless of income and regardless of demographic status, people that live in well-balanced communities generally just are more hopeful about the future. They trust one another. And I think a lot of this has to do with the familiarity that comes with engaging with people on a regular basis, knowing people, even if you go into that cafe or coffee shop regularly and you don't know the barista's name or you don't know their last name, that familiarity breeds a certain type of community confidence that is hard to instill in any other way. And so I think that when we look at how to revitalize communities, we should be thinking about the whole community and how well balanced it is. We have a long-standing interest in affordable housing here in the United States, as you do in the UK. I have a great respect for Robin and her colleagues at HUD. I've spent 2 years earlier in my career there as well, and have a great appreciation for the work that they do at communities, and have invested a lot in the kind of community infrastructure in and around affordable housing. But affordable housing can sometimes drive our discussions about revitalizing lower income or distressed areas. And I think that what we should be thinking more about is how to create more affordable communities themselves, affordable, well-balanced communities where lower income residents have access to those sorts of things, like the parks, like the libraries, and the supermarkets, and the third places where they can meet and talk with their friends, because those actually contribute a lot to the transmission of ideas, to the introduction of people to each other, through which people find job opportunities, through which they find enhanced networks that they couldn't do on their own. And so that actual physical infrastructure, the way that community is designed, I think should take a more important place in our discussions about what makes successful communities than some of the more limited, albeit positive, types of issues that we focused on before. So I'm happy to talk more about that later in the discussion, but I'll yield back the time now.
Brilliant. Very, very interesting. Thank you, Ryan. So you talked about the kind of importance of a kind of amenity-rich areas. And I'm just thinking about, the types of amenities that you discussed. There's certainly, particularly in the UK, a mixture of public and privately owned institutions there. And I'm just thinking, to get an area which is rich in all these different types of amenities, are there kind of foundational institutions or amenities that need to be in place to then get the coffee shop, to then get, the nice cafes, to then get a gym? What's all of these obviously matter, but are there kind of foundational institutions from your research which seem to be really important to then getting that civicness? If you said to a policymaker or to a community, what is the most important amenity or institution which is really going to kickstart civicness, what would you say to them?
Great question. I think that there's a strong correlation between access to high quality schools and strong communities, and also a commitment to public safety. People need to know that the place where they're living is a place where they can spend time in the park freely, with or without their dog, and enjoy it without fear for their own safety. And when schools rebound in an area where perhaps they've been low performing before, that gives families the confidence in the future that they can stay there a long time. And so I think the educational environment and the public safety environment are two really critical pieces that, if you don't focus on, the other things have a harder time following on. And the third one might be a little bit more abstract, but is important, and that is just a dedication from public sector officials to work with community leaders, and a demonstrated way in which of engaging them. So there has to be that's important, because you need kind of a baseline community level trust, which can really only be fostered when public sector leaders are reaching out to community leaders and involving them in the decision-making about the future of the community. So some habit and practice of that kind of engagement at the community level is an important kind of institutional framework for these other things to follow.
Brilliant. Thank you for that. So what's great about this set of speakers is obviously not only from different countries, but also from different political and philosophical backgrounds. So we'll now move to Diana, who's obviously a Labour MP here in the UK.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and thank you very much for the invitation to join you this afternoon for this very timely discussion. And it's already been fascinating to listen to the other panel members, and I'm particularly struck by the references to COVID, the effect that's had on both of our countries, and also climate change as well. I just thought I ought to say at the outset that I've got a personal interest in left behind neighbourhoods and communities, because I represent a city, Hull, up in East Yorkshire, that I think would describe itself as feeling at times left behind. We were quite a prosperous city for many years. We had a big fishing fleet, but sadly that fishing industry died away in the 1970s, and we've really struggled since then to get the economic regeneration that we need in the city, and that's had a knock-on impact on the social infrastructure of the city. And whilst we've got a thriving university and we've got now a new industry around offshore wind. We produce some of the really big wind turbine blades out in the North Sea. We still suffer from left behind communities in many parts of my own constituency. And as I think Danny said earlier on, the Brexit vote a few years ago, Hull voted overwhelmingly to leave the EU. And part of that was that feeling of not of being left behind, not getting our fair share in Hull. So just to move on from that, quite a few years ago, I spent some time one summer visiting the United States, and I looked at some regeneration schemes in communities. Particularly, I went to Buffalo and San Diego. And in those areas, they were starting to look not only at economic regeneration, but the wider community regeneration issues too. So I'm, of course, really interested to hear about what's happening now, the developing interest in social infrastructure emerging across the Atlantic, and the scale of commitment made by the Biden administration to investing in it, and the £10 billion committed to the Community Revitalization Fund is equivalent, as I understand it, to almost 1.4 billion in the UK on a per capita basis. And it's a clear example of where the bar has been set when it comes to targeted investment in community-led regeneration. And it's the sort of investment not seen in the UK since the last Labour government's New Deal for Communities programme. And it does contrast significantly with what we've been talking about earlier on, with a primarily local government-led, economic infrastructure focused approach to levelling up so far that we've taken in the UK. Yes, of course, we need investment in upgrading transport infrastructure and supporting our local economies. And as an MP for Hull, tucked away right in the far corner of East Yorkshire, I see the need for better transport infrastructure every day. But we also, of course, need to invest in supporting and working alongside communities to turn around the social infrastructure of places, particularly those facing the additional challenge of significant deprivation alongside struggling with long-term economic investment. And it's no good doing up town centres and sorting out roundabouts and rail links if the people living on the edge of town with few or no local facilities or amenities to sustain the community, and the benefits of the Towns Fund or Shared Prosperity scheme means that you have to spend £6 on a return trip by bus that only comes every hour if you're going to get to where you can see the benefits of that investment. And we've heard about what's happening in the United States, and the evidence base for that sort of hyper-local, community-focused investment is increasingly in place over here as well. Now, I co-chair the all-party parliamentary group on Left Behind Neighbourhoods, which has highlighted the particular challenges facing communities living in neighbourhoods that are both deprived and lack social infrastructure. They are home currently to about 2.4 million people across England and are predominantly located in coastal areas and on the outskirts of post-industrial towns and cities in the North and Midlands. And we know from over a year of evidence sessions organised by the APPG the extent to which many of these communities have seen both the destruction of local economies and the hollowing out of the institutions and structures that held communities together. Whether those are the shared workplace, perhaps through trade unions or the local pub or the local working men's club or the churches, or indeed increasingly community centres and youth clubs, as decades of austerity has taken its toll. And we can see how these same places suffer from significantly worse social outcomes than other equally deprived areas. But I think there are some signs that we are seeing the scale of the challenge becoming more widely accepted now. The work of the APPG has shown the extent that acknowledging tackling this issue is a priority that extends across party lines. And my APPG co-chair, Paul Howell, would probably make many of the same points I'm making today, albeit perhaps in slightly different terms. And earlier this month, the former Bank of England chief economist, Andy Haldane, highlighted the importance of addressing this very issue as part of any plan to revive local economies. And in Local Trust Community Power Lecture, he said that without social infrastructure, left behind places find themselves stuck in a circle of decline, repelling rather than attracting people and skills, finance and commerce, the raw building blocks of economic success. Now, if only to reinforce this point, last week, Frontier Economics published their findings into the economic case of social infrastructure investment in left behind communities, which found that for every £1 million invested, there are likely to be economic and fiscal returns worth £3.2 million. And that includes a £0.7 million boost in employment, training and skills opportunities for local residents. So getting it right has never been more important. Clearly, we're not the United States, and what works there may not work here, but the Biden administration have provided a template for extending the levelling up agenda to communities and neighbourhoods, rebuilding the social infrastructure that sustains community life alongside turning around their local economies. So now is the time for the United Kingdom government to make a similarly ambitious commitment to community-focused regeneration at a neighbourhood level across the country. And just to agree with what Danny said, it has to be long-term. Short-term funding just does not work. Thanks very much.
Lovely. Thank you, Diana, and thank you for rooting your perspectives in your constituency in Hull. A question for me, which is, we're talking a lot here, sorry to use kind of economist or economic language, which is around the supply side, so thinking about the infrastructure, social infrastructure for people to participate. But what are the kind of demand side barriers? So I think about Sure Start centres, which obviously your Labour government introduced several decades ago. They were placed in almost all communities, but there were still people who didn't engage with these. There were family hubs, I suppose, for parents with children under the age of 5. So yes, you can put the infrastructure in place, but what are the kind of motivations that people need to participate? How do you remove the barriers to that, the kind of time barriers, the practical barriers that they may face? So it's not just a supply side issue of the social infrastructure. What are the kind of demand side barriers that we need to be thinking about?
Well, I think I'd just start by saying and reiterating my last point, actually, which I just made about the need for and politicians. I mean, I'm a politician, so I want things done tomorrow. I want to see change tomorrow. And what I do know is that actually, if you're going to see change, it is that long-term investment in communities. So you talked about Sure Start centres. I think they did an excellent job, but you're absolutely right. They perhaps didn't do everything we wanted them to do. Now, because they were in place for 10 years and then it changed because of cuts to services and a refocusing on what the Sure Start centres provided, it didn't have the length of time, I think, these kind of schemes need to really bed in, to become part of the accepted infrastructure in your community. So I'm looking at 15, 20 odd years in terms of really seeing changes happen. So I think that's one of the key things for me. And also the other thing, of course, is that you can't do things to communities. The only way you're going to get buy-in and see real change is to actually get alongside the communities and work with the communities. So it's no good putting money in and building nice buildings in a deprived area. What you actually need to be doing is working alongside the people who live in that area to develop the skills and knowledge they have to be able to, for example, run the local cafe that might have closed down, or run the local pub, or run the library. because in the areas that are left behind in my patch, those are the kind of things where if the local authority steps away because of budget cuts, nobody else has the social capital, I guess, to actually do that. Whereas in other parts of the country where there are people who've got experience and knowledge and skills, they bring that to the table straight away. So I think it's about the long term and really embedding into a community and getting alongside people.
Great, thank you. And I certainly agree with you on the long-termism. And in fact, the national evaluation of Sure Start, although the evidence wasn't great on parent and child outcomes to begin with, it did get better as the programme advanced. So it's worth stressing that. And the other thing, I think, just thinking about Sure Start, is obviously this is about children and young children. And often children are a kind of social glue. They're a trigger point for parents to participate in new activities, forge new relationships. So maybe we need to be thinking about how we can create places and spaces for children, particularly in these communities, because that's how then parents think, well, this is how I form new relationships. So, you know, children as triggers, as it were, for this sort of social capital, I think is worth thinking about. Jennifer, over to you.
Sure, and thanks so much. And thanks so much to all of you for having me here today. So I'm Jennifer Bay. Again, I'm a senior fellow with Brookings and director of the Anne and Robert and Bass Center for Transformative Placemaking. So launched at the end of 2018, our stated mission of the center is to inspire public, private, and civic sector actors to make transformative place investments that generate widespread social and economic benefits. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about why we think this relationship between place and placemaking and economic and social inclusion is so critical, and why this perspective really might be useful when considering both the importance and structure of programs like the proposed Community Revitalization Fund or other place-centered policies and programs. So what maybe I can try to do here as I'm coming up the rear on the panel is to try to knit some of the threads of the conversation we've been having so far together. So, you know, place has, of course, always mattered to our economic and our social lives, but it's a relationship that's really constantly evolving. So if you think about the 19th century, for example, it's a time when in America and elsewhere across the globe, of course, where America's cities were growing to become not only centers of commerce and of trade, but really powerhouses of invention and of industry. And then within these cities, the variable needs of businesses and workers determined where and how they were clustered. And this is how our downtowns grew up and our industrial districts, as well as our dense working class neighborhoods. Of course, the demands for place really dramatically changed during the 20th century as the advent of the automobile, coupled with new infrastructure investments and housing and land use policies, and the changing demands of industry, led to the move of people and jobs to greener and often whiter suburban pastures, while leaving many urban communities really in decline and distress. So this changing relationship between place and economy has given us those varied patterns of concentration and dispersion and of racial and economic segregation that really still largely characterize American cities and suburbs today. And this is something Danny brought up in his comments as well. But of course, we know these patterns aren't static. As with past innovations, today's digital revolution is enabling the creation of new products and services that also have the potential to improve our health and our environment and our overall quality of life. But it's also causing new and disruptive impacts on our growth and development patterns. So, you know, in the first place, our desire for greater collaboration among both firms and workers, together with the rise of the sharing economy, is actually causing some higher demand for levels of density and proximity that facilitate interaction and exchange. And this means of ideas, certainly, but also even more tangible items, from housing, think Airbnb, to transportation, like Lyft and Uber and the other services. So while COVID has obviously dampened some of these trends in ways I think we really can't fully predict, these are clearly broad forces that we already know long outlived the pandemic. Somewhat related, the rise of flexible and remote work, which predated the pandemic, but certainly has been accelerated by it, is changing companies' needs for fixed office space. And while, again, we don't know what all the implications of these shifts are going to be, we do know that there will be impacts both across regions and also within them, in both cities and particularly downtown areas that have tended to have a lot of office space, but also suburbs. And among other things, a lot of these shifts probably don't bode terribly well for isolated and antiquated and poorly designed office development, whose purpose is just increasingly becoming somewhat irrelevant. And then finally, as more, and again, of course, with COVID, more shoppers go online, the country's retail landscape is really being shaken. At the same time, the real estate industry is also sort of visibly struggling to deliver even brick and mortar retail in the right locations. So many establishments that are located in auto-centric suburban shopping malls are becoming increasingly obsolete and in need of a new purpose. And while retail in more walkable areas has been in high demand, only about 12% of American retail square footage in the top 30 MSAs is actually located in these kind of walkable areas. So all these disruptions that are being caused by the digital revolution are also occurring in tandem with a powerful demographic revolution that's having its own complementary impacts on place, with diversifying populations and changing household structures, leading to shifting demands for housing, as well as increasing demands for more walkable and vibrant communities in which to live and to work and to recreate. So all these trends are yielding a lot of positive impacts. After decades of sprawl and suburban dominance in this country, over the past few decades, our cities have been experiencing rebounding populations, growing employment, and new public and private sector investments in infrastructure and in real estate and placemaking. And this has really led to some new and revitalized areas of economic activity, particularly in our historic downtowns, along waterfronts, and even in innovation districts, where research institutions and entrepreneurs are tending, increasingly to cluster and connect with one another. They're also fueling the rapid rise of more mixed use and walkable suburban districts as well. But the fact is that too many places are still really failing to meet the needs of people, as so many of us have discussed on this webinar so far. And what it's really doing is limiting the potential and the prosperity of entire cities and entire metropolitan areas. So, on one hand, as my colleague Mark Muro and others have shown, if you look across the US, the digital economy is increasingly rewarding large global centers that are attracting innovative companies and highly educated workers, while many of our older industrial cities and our heartland communities, particularly a lot of small and mid-sized places, are just still struggling to keep pace. And of course, many of these same winner-take-most trends are also playing out within regions, reinforcing or exacerbating, in many cases, the spatial disparities that were created by decades of policies and practices that devalued and segregated, and actually sometimes just physically destroyed urban, low-income and minority communities. Meanwhile, many of our suburban communities are themselves grappling with aging infrastructure and rising numbers of poor residents amid auto-centric designs that just lack the walkability and connectivity that are needed by both residents and businesses alike. So, all the events of the past year and a half have exacerbated a lot of these place-based challenges nationwide, revealing the life and death consequences of economic inequality and racial segregation and sprawl, and just really threatening the whole vitality of our cities and regions. And these problems are really systemic and interconnected, and thus are really going to require systemic and interconnected solutions to solve. And yet a lot of our current systems and approaches are just still too siloed to meet the moment. So, our economic development strategies, for one thing, often just simply lack a focus on place at all, or placemaking, and certainly they don't tend to have necessarily a lens towards racial equity, or at least they haven't in the past. So city and regional economic development policy and practice is just agnostic to place, or it's undertaken just simply in reaction to a government program, a promise zone, in the past empowerment zones, opportunity zones, perhaps even, the new proposed Community Revitalization Fund, or they're taken in reaction to private firms or anchor institutions that are looking for a development site. And what this often means is they're not proactive in terms of how they approach place, and this often just leads to uncoordinated and mismatched development that fails to benefit underserved communities or larger economic development goals. At the same time, community development, for its part, often lacks a focus on economic development and wealth building and the role that communities play or possibly could play in their broader regional economies. As others have mentioned, community development is traditionally focused on affordable housing and service delivery, which obviously, while very, very critical in many of these communities, are often aimed more at alleviating the symptoms of poverty rather than actually dismantling the structures that really enable it. Land use planning, for its part, often lacks a focus on economic and community development insofar as it doesn't really coordinate land use and infrastructure planning decisions alongside other regional economic and equity and community goals. And then finally, traditional placemaking is limited in both scope and scale. It tends to focus on activities and investments in the public realm that improve quality of life, certainly, but are sort of by their design or nature necessarily oriented towards broader community revitalization and economic inclusion objectives. So all these kind of policies and programs really need to be designed in ways that require all these fields to come together, certainly in deep partnership with communities themselves, to advance interconnected solutions that harness the market and the demographic trends that I noted earlier in ways that benefit more people and more places than really a lot of these trends have to date. So to this end, the Bass Center, in partnership with many, many other people and many other organizations, is working to elevate this whole concept of what we're calling transformative placemaking as a new form of integrated practice that advances a set of outcome-oriented objectives for places experiencing a whole wide range of challenge. So this can mean strong market places facing affordability pressures, to historically marginalized areas that are still grappling with this investment, to rural main streets that are struggling up against economic decline. So regardless of this specific place context, transformative placemaking really strives to nurture, and this is really our framework for what transformative placemaking is all about, economic ecosystems that are regionally connected, that are innovative, and that are rooted in the assets of local residents and local businesses. Built environments that are accessible and flexible and supportive of community health and resiliency. Social environments that are cohesive and really reflect community history and identity. And then civic structures, and these can be either formal or informal, that are locally organized, inclusive, and really support network building and support those social structures across their communities. And so what our whole theory of change here is that this isn't just about the places themselves, but by pursuing this holistic set of outcomes for places, what we call the hyperlocal, transformative placemaking can simultaneously solve for the multiple challenges that are facing many of these communities, and then ultimately create more prosperous and more equitable and more resilient cities and regions. So it sort of comes down to place really matters for these broader city and regional objectives. And I think it's programs and investments by all levels of government and certainly the public and private and civic sectors that are really needed in this kind of integrated way to really make these places thrive. So I'll stop there. I know there's folks who are viewing probably have a lot of questions, and I know people really want to get into discussion, but thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you, Jennifer. Very, very interesting. I mean, one thing I've noticed throughout this whole discussion is just this sort of tension, I suppose, between giving autonomy and control to local communities to decide how to use funds, how to revive their own areas, which I understand. And then also saying, well, actually, we can't have a siloed approach. It needs to be, holistic. And of course, that's not necessarily a demand to those areas, but it's a guidance. And I'm just wondering on the kind of spectrum from here's a law, you must do X, Y, and Z, to the other end of the spectrum, which is here's a load of cash, do what you want. What's the kind of right point in the spectrum in which to guide communities based on good evidence, based on good practice elsewhere, to get the best outcomes? Surely it can't be the end of those extremes. Is there a sweet spot somewhere, or does it depend on the issue and the particular program that you're thinking about?
I mean, I could weigh in a little bit on this. In fact, we are at the Bass Center with Project for Public Spaces editing a book that's focusing on what we're referring as place governance, sort of the formal civic structures that exist in communities, anything from what we call business improvement districts to community development corporations to all sorts of other entities and organizations that actually work within places at that hyperlocal scale. And the book really, it's an edited volume, and across the chapters, it's actually trying to get at some of these issues and some of these tensions between places and having places be more self-directed, working in partnership with public entities and others, but being able to have the organizational structures and capacity to set their own vision and strategies, and from our perspective, certainly more in this holistic way, and place allows you to do that in many ways. Because if you're focused on outcomes for place, it allows you to see that intersectionality between the social and the civic and the economic and the built environment, I think, much more readily. But to your point, and what the book tries to do is raise up that there are tensions in this, right? Because on one hand, I think we come at it from a normative perspective that having communities have their own voice and vision and strategies for themselves, and for the folks that already live there, is enormously important. At the same time, cities themselves have broader objectives that are also important for the success of their cities around things like affordable housing, or infrastructure investments, or things that are that affect cities or regions as a whole. And sometimes those objectives can come up against each other. For example, you could have a community that sets their own vision, but maybe it's to exclude affordable housing, for example, in their community, which obviously isn't in the best interests of the city as a whole, for example. So I think there is a tension between wanting and needing communities to have some level of voice and direction, and the capacity, the financial capacity, the organizational capacity to invest in their place in the way that they think is appropriate, while at the same time understanding that there are broader objectives that cross places and that also need to be met. And I think it's finding ways within these organizations and by working with the public sector to find the balance that between the two. And I think if we can reconcile with a lot of these tensions and just be honest about what they are, I think we'll ultimately be able to build these kind of social and civic infrastructures that actually do work more, better and work for more people.
Great stuff. Thank you. What I'm going to do now is start bringing in questions from the audience. We've had a lot. Just to remind people watching at home that if you do want to ask questions, you can do so through Slido, which is just below the YouTube screen that you're watching. So I'm going to take some questions and direct them to some people. We did have someone called Daniel Dipper who just asked, bottom-up projects are usually more successful, so how can we ensure to respect community autonomy and allow local people to lead revitalization? I think Jennifer has just answered that, so that's great. I think we'll start with some kind of more academic questions, actually. So Rob McMillan from Sheffield Hallam University has said, these programs are often targeted at specific, usually depleted communities. How can we do so without pathologizing them, even implicitly? And then a kind of connected question from Dan Coots, who asks, the term social capital is used a lot in community regeneration, but what is it and how can policy interventions change or enhance it? I might start with the kind of more policy academic speakers here. So Ryan, maybe you want to have a crack at one of those.
Okay, thank you. Good questions. I'll start with the second one first. Social capital is often used for a number of different sort of definitional purposes, but I think at its heart, social capital is that value that comes from relationships and the networks people have with others that allow them to do certain things that they would not be able to do alone. So you have often in the literature, you have what social scientists will call bonding social capital. That's at the household level, the more tribal nature of social capital that builds trust within a tight community, which you actually do need to be able to raise children well, to be able to get things done. But by itself, it can lead to tribalism, which is where another form of social capital, which is often referred to as bridging social capital, makes a difference. And those are the kinds of networks and connections that are established in schools, at university, through professional associations, where you're meeting people who are unlike you, and yet you have a common purpose. You have something that is of a common interest. And so it's these relationships that people have with others that basically form the bedrock of social capital. And it's been shown not just in affluent communities, but also in low income communities to result in very tangible sorts of things like better paying jobs, more rapid attachment to the workforce, and attachment to jobs with a future. Even in lower income communities that have been distressed, when people have more relationships and they have more people in their lives that they trust, it actually can yield good things. So social capital is ultimately this stock of social networks and relationships that has some kind of value, which is why we use the word capital in there as well, for people to achieve the kinds of things that they care about. Secondly, a lot of place-based economic development has not worked out. I think is implied by the first question, and there've been, there's kind of a long track record of failures there. And so I think that it is important not to mythologize certain communities, but rather to look at what the basic asset reality is and asset possibility is for a particular area, and thinking sort of anew. So one thing that comes to mind, and I'll just leave it at this, I'm sure others have better thoughts than this, but one is a smarter and more creative approach to regional thinking, where certain communities used to be hubs of vibrant economic activity themselves, and that's now dissipated. And along with it, a lot of civic infrastructure. Strategies for investing in place often need to look at those communities not as what they were, but as what they could be in the context of the region where they are. We had some experience with this in the Midwest, part of the United States, with a state experiment in the state of Indiana a few years ago, which carved up the state into about 11 regions and essentially sent funds to those regions on the premise that the hub of economic activity there would work with outlying areas to create common strategies for connecting them together. So what may have been previously a small manufacturing hub, which has now been dissipated, could become something of a commuter suburb to the larger community. And the strategy focused more on creating connectivity rather than trying to revitalize a lost industry, which is really, really hard to do. So it's hard to do regional economic development, but I think when you look at places distinctly unto themselves only, you're really limited in what you can achieve. And thinking regionally is where I think some of the new opportunities for development are that are place-based.
Great, thank you for that, Ryan. So Danny and Diana, just to ask you really, I mean, we're trying to be quite academic in defining what social capital is, but what, for just the average person, what does it look like? What does a community which is high in social capital look like and feel like? Maybe Danny, you want to go for it.
Well, I echo what Ryan was saying, and it can be measured in terms of trust and relationship, but fundamentally it's a place where people feel that they are known and secure and that they have some agency. And the interesting tension between bonding and bridging capital is always very relevant here, because you can feel known and have agency in a sort of monoculture, and people outside that culture effectively have the balancing deficit of social capital. So it's got to be inclusive. But fundamentally, to my mind, it's somewhere that people feel that they belong meaningfully, and they have some influence over the decisions that affect their lives. And that's where we really struggle if we create essentially sort of patriarchal state that does everything for people. But equally, you can't, as I feel we've done in many ways, reduce services to the point that people are unsupported. So getting the balance right between provision and self-reliance and mutual aid is the eternal challenge for a society and a government. But in between those two is something like a functioning community where social capital is grown.
Diana?
Well, I was just thinking when Danny was speaking then about social capital that, and just goes back to my constituency. I have a ward in my constituency, so that's one of the building blocks of the bigger constituency area that's I'd say is very high in social capital. You know, it's got a sense of community. It's got those assets we were talking about earlier on, good schools, a nice street where there's cafes and coffee shops. It's got a community hub where you can go and do pottery and arts. It's a place where people say, oh yes, I live in the avenues, because it's a kind of recognized space. And there's that kind of, I'd say that's very rich in social capital. And then I look at another bit of my constituency, which is a big council estate, where I think people don't have that sense of belonging in the same way. It doesn't have those basic amenities we're talking about. And where it does, it has a library that looks like it was built out of in someone's shed. It's not a nice welcoming building. And that, I think, people don't feel particularly safe in either. And that issue about feeling safe in your community and feeling you're part of an area you can walk around is quite important. So I think just in the small city of Hull, that there's real stark differences between where there's social capital and where there isn't. And I just also wanted to pick up on that idea about city regions, and the idea where perhaps cities that have had a past which they need to reinvent themselves, they can do it with the region that they sit within. That seems to me a really attractive idea for parts of the UK and parts of Yorkshire in particular. And the government are currently engaging in Danny talked about the fact that we are a very centralized country, but we are also at the moment going through this process of devolution and trying to establish and give people a sense that they belong in an area and that they have more control over decisions made in that area. So we're going through this idea of having city mayors or regional mayors, which is starting to have some effect. And I think that could be quite powerful as well in building up that idea of social capital and a feeling of belonging and being part of something.
Great, thank you, Diana. I'm going to take some more questions and I'm going to direct them to Robin and Jennifer. So they're all anonymous. So the first one is to Robin, which says, why are the US proposals focusing on putting money directly in the hands of communities rather than through municipalities? We touched on that a little bit, but it'd be good to know the reasoning behind it. And the second question, again from an anonymous person, is, do agricultural areas and places where industry has disappeared have distinct or different needs from inner urban areas? And how does the Community Revitalization Fund recognise that? So 2 questions for you there, Robin. And then to you, Jennifer, another anonymous one asks, the US measures are conditional upon social trust within and between communities and a reduction of deeply partisan tensions. How will this be addressed? So perhaps to you first, Robin.
Great. Great. So the first question about why are we choosing to fund local community organizations rather than the municipality or the local jurisdiction. We have a number of funds within both the Department of Housing and Urban Development, as well as within other federal partners that do directly fund local municipalities, states, or counties. And so our Community Development Block Grant funding is another program that's been around for decades, and it funds more than 2,000 local jurisdictions, whether a state, again, a county or a city. And so those funds within that community can be used to fund a local organization, or they can be used to fund infrastructure, to build housing. They're very flexible funds that can be used for a number of purposes. Part of the reason that we're making the decision to fund directly to local organizations is that within that Community Development Block Grant funding, the priorities are set by the community and the jurisdiction, but there are projects that aren't able to be funded through those resources. Either the community doesn't have enough resources to meet all of the needs, or I think to Jennifer's point about the tension between some of these types of initiatives, is they may not be sort of the highest radar for these projects may not be on the highest radar for that community, but they're still important to a local neighborhood or a local organization. So we've decided that we really want to, and we also want to build that capacity of these local organizations to be able to realize their own project. They may then be able to access other funding from a local jurisdiction or other funding from their state, or philanthropic funding or private capital. So we're really trying to have both models at the same time, and we'll work internally to see how they intersect and how they can really expand the ability of the larger community to meet its needs. So I think then the second one is just really kind of the difference between rural and urban settings and what are their similarities and their challenges. I would say that rural communities and distressed communities often have similar needs in terms of needing affordable housing, needing economic investment, needing social services and public services and infrastructure. But the way that funding gets to them is often different. Often rural communities have a lower capacity in some of their, just because there are fewer people. Sometimes they're run by, a mayor that is possibly part-time or has another job and doesn't have as many staff within their community, so their organizational structure is limited. So there are different considerations for rural communities than urban communities, but I think on the larger, I think they share similar needs. And one of the things for the Community Revitalization Fund is really allowing communities to tell us what their needs are, how they're planning to solve them, and then to really work with them to alongside, not directing, but alongside to help them to realize their goals and their visions in a flexible way.
Great, thank you, Robin. So Jennifer, to you, and I think the question really, in the UK, we sort of look to the US and think, gosh, it's much more partisan on political and cultural issues. The sort of phrase culture wars, and the fear that it's going to come to the UK. And so I think the question which is being asked is sort of reflecting on how community building can be impacted by those sort of partisan trends that we're seeing.
Sure, it's certainly a fair question. I think, on one hand, we do have a lot of partisan conflict of various sorts across places, and to some extent within them, though sometimes I think the way our country is being fragmented, often, you've got big regional differences between, sort of Republican, Democratic, party kind of politics. Having said that, when you look across communities, when it comes to a lot of the issues we're talking about here, they absolutely transcend, partisan politics. I think when you get down into that local level, communities are still struggling with a lot of the same issues around equity, around social inclusion, around economic traction, around affordability issues, and it sort of depends on the market context. Different communities are, some are struggling, are in very hot marketplaces, and affordability is a huge problem. In other places, frankly, affordability is less of a problem, but there's still deep economic divisions between places. And so the market context may differ across regions, within regions, and certainly between urban and rural areas. But still a lot of the challenges, transcend a lot of these things. Having said that, I think aside from the partisan issues, when you get down into that hyperlocal, on one hand, you may have some of the tensions that I mentioned between kind of broader city or regional objectives and objectives of the community themselves. But also, I don't think we can kind of romanticize community to say that just because everybody lives in a particular neighborhood, that they necessarily all, share absolutely the same values or the same desires for their communities. You know, places are constantly in flux, and there's, you know, always tensions between people who may have lived in a community for a long time and new people that are coming in. Even among people who are new or existing in a community, they themselves might have different priorities based on, you know, their family needs or a whole bunch of other things. And so I think, you know, picking up on something Danny said, it's really about having structures that allow people to at least feel like they have some agency and some voice. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody always gets everything they want all the time, even in the best circumstances. But it's how do you create those kind of structures that at least allows people to feel like they have some sort of voice, you know, in what's happening in their community. And again, they can be more formalized kind of structures, or sometimes it is, you know, through a church or some other social structure that already exists in a community. But I think, you know, one of the things we see here is, you know, sometimes there are organizations that work on behalf of a community, but they may not be working on behalf of all that community. Business improvement districts are a great example. They do, you know, great work in a lot of places around placemaking, around making investments in places. But the way they're structured here and even globally is they are based on, you know, assessments of business owners who often then sit on the governing boards and make the decisions. And so you can see why there's going to be some you know, potential challenges there, in that they're investing in, you know, the public realm that serves residents and tenants and, you know, renters and other people who may not actually have a place or an active ability to make those decisions in their community because the organization isn't structured that way. So I think as we think about these civic structures, as we think about these organizational structures, it's asking questions about, you know, who benefits, who has an opportunity to actually legitimately make decisions, who can be meaningfully engaged in those decisions, and you know, I think and then who's benefiting, you know, and that's partly about the decision making, understanding that hey, there's always going to be, you know, people are going to win a little and they're going to lose a little, because, you know, communities are full of you know, a diversity of people that you know, have different needs and different desires.
Great, thank you for that. So we are nearing the end. So I suppose I'm going to ask a final question of all the speakers, which is just reflecting on this sort of transatlantic conversation. Is there anything that's come up which has been surprising or interesting to you, new, which you hadn't really appreciated before, hadn't really seen the kind of importance of, or just something which is happening in the other country which actually you've never heard of, and actually that's quite interesting, it's a new trend, it's a new initiative. So yeah, just to kind of reflect on what's happening on the other side of the Atlantic and what you might find interesting. So I might start with Ryan, if that's okay.
Sure, thank you. It's been great to listen to my colleagues talk through these issues, and I think the thing that I'm perhaps just most animated by right now are the ways in which we can continue to learn from each other because the underlying issues are so similar in both places. I think the increased recognition that people-based policies, as much as I'm a proponent of those myself, are inadequate to revitalize places is something that we've kind of come to a bit of a consensus on in both countries, it seems, for a lot of the same reasons. And so I think this is a really great opportunity for us to continue this dialogue, to continue to stay in touch with each other and to continue to learn from one another, because these issues really are very intertwined in very similar ways in both places.
Yes, very much agree with that. Thank you. Diana.
Well, I think one of the things I'm really concerned about is the climate crisis that we're in, and how that then feeds into the policy making around this whole area around left behind neighbourhoods. And of course, in the UK, we've got COP26 coming up in November, and often people say, you know, dealing with the climate and issues around it are sort of the last thing that people in disadvantaged areas and communities are worried about. But actually, it's probably something that needs to be threaded through all of the policy and all of the changes we want to see in our areas. it just needs to be there. So I think that's what I've been struck from hearing from our colleagues in the US about climate change, and also obviously they talked about the racial issues that I think are different to the ones we have in the UK, but that whole issue of equality and justice and fairness feeding into this whole area.
Yes, very much agree with that. And we've done a lot of work at Bright Blue on that, and looking at the kind of support for the net zero agenda there is amongst all communities, including in so-called left behind communities, but also thinking about the kind of trade-offs and tensions that there might be, for example, between levelling up and net zero. Often there's a lot of alignment, but there's obviously some issues as well. And just to use the opportunity to flag a paper that we brought out today from Bright Blue, just looking at how we have more consistent carbon taxation across different sectors, and also dividends, particularly for low and middle income voters, who can kind of reap the rewards from the increased revenue that might come from decarbonisation and the green transition. So do look out for that on our website. But yes, particularly concerned about making sure that the green transition is a just transition, to use the phrase, and that low-income people in particular feel that they are benefiting from that transition. I think it's really important for policymakers. Danny.
Well, I'd echo that point of Diana's, and I guess it's been helpful for me to hear about the American model, and I think I agree that fundamentally, whether it's climate or other sort of social justice questions, we're going to fix these problems by fixing our relationships with each other, and that is a local mission as much as anything else. And if we and our economy is disordered, and that's why we have such challenges in the environment, and to get a properly ordered economy means a better local settlement, and that means, coming back to the point we all keep making, the need for strong social foundations for our places. So I think this threads through. This is not just a question about making nice livable places for local communities. It's about fixing the order that we live in globally and nationally. So it couldn't be more important. And a kind of bottom-up revolution around place feels like the idea for our decade, and that's a very, very good thing. And it's right that it's the decade of action on the climate as well, and those two things are intricately connected.
Great stuff. Jennifer.
Yeah, and I'll just sort of follow up on that. I mean, I think that's exactly right. And I think there are opportunities, and I think this is by thinking about how we create those spaces within places that allow a lot of that connectivity to happen. And there's some really interesting work here in the US, the Reimagining the Commons work, for example, that's trying to focus on a lot of these issues of how do you make those kind of investments, in places that actually allow those kind of relationships to happen. And that's really at the heart of it, why place is so important, because it does give us that ability to identify the outcomes that people do want to see in their communities, and then to see that relationship between the built environment and the strong social environment. Are you creating the spaces that allow that to happen, and how that in turn can influence the economic life of a place, for example. So I love what you said about this is the time to be coming back and to really thinking about place. And I think if nothing else, the events of the past 18 months have really shown us, to Ryan's point, just how important place is. And it's not just place as collections of people. It's actually the places themselves that can either help drive opportunity or take it away from people, right? And so while we have to be investing in people, there's no doubt that we have to be thinking about the place as well as part of that if we really want people to thrive.
Thank you. And then final thoughts from you, Robin.
Great, thank you. Just echoing what everyone has said, and I really appreciate this dialogue and look forward to it continuing. I think what I'm struck with is just the real commitment and the real need to invest in the agency of people in their communities to make their own decisions and to then support them as a government partner with patient capital, with long-term funding, with the resources that are needed to see their projects or their programs or the efforts that they choose to do to succeed, but really making sure that we're really taking a new opportunity to have people participate in their own design of their place and being able to support them. So I'm really excited by the dialogue that we've had today, and really learning the lessons from the UK as well as from my US partners as well here, and really appreciate the opportunity to have this dialogue as we embark on the approval of this exciting fund, and then really designing it so that it really does become a model. I was also struck by Danny's mention of a permanent endowment. So those are really exciting opportunities to think long-term. How do we build this model so that it can be there in the future and can be a new way of doing business? Thank you.
Brilliant. It was a fascinating discussion, lots of learning for people from both countries. And, let's keep the conversation going. As Ryan said, I hope this is the kind of start of, continuing to swap notes, check progress, and keep learning from one another, because I think it's helpful for policy progress. Thank you to the local trust for partnering with us, Bright Blue, on this event. Thank you to the audience at home. I hope you've enjoyed it and found it really interesting. Thank you for your questions. And of course, thank you to our speakers, Diana, Ryan, Robin, Jennifer, and Danny, for your time and thoughts. We are really grateful. It's really fascinating. Have a good afternoon or morning if you're in the US. And thank you, and hope to see you at another Bright Blue event soon.